everything for me was a cost-benefit analysis. Everything. What are we spending and what are we getting? And without exception, I would argue that that was what I engaged in. And if it was to save a buck, to do the same, to deliver the same goods and services, I was all about that. If it was about, you know, same amount of money, better goods and services, I was all about that. So in that context, I wanted to take a really hard look at the war on drugs in this country. And I came at it from the standpoint that half of what we spend on law enforcement, the courts, and the prisons is drug-related. So I wanted to take a hard look at the war on drugs, and I wanted to include legalization as a potential alternative. We're spending $70 billion a year on law enforcement, the courts, and the prisons. And what are we getting for it? Well, we're arresting 1.8 million people a year in this country. So in starting out this process of let's take a hard look at the war on drugs, what I had to start out, where I wanted to start was Holland, which this was 1999, and according to the government, Holland was just a terrible place to live. That drug use was out the roof, that crime was rampant, and it all had to do with drugs. So I guess I better start here. Well, I look at Holland, and in a very, very short amount of time, find out that Holland has 60% the drug use as that of the United States. Now that's on a per capita basis, but that's kids, that's adults, that's marijuana, and that's hard drugs. Portugal effectively decriminalized all drugs 10 years ago, and statistically they are showing a dramatic decrease in drug use. Dramatic decrease in drug use. You know, counterintuitive. The other thing that I had been that the government had said, or that we hear all the time, is that it is a gateway drug, that marijuana is a gateway drug. Well, come to find out, that's just not the case. And I don't drink, but I have drank alcohol. I don't smoke marijuana, but I have smoked marijuana. I will tell you from my own personal experience that marijuana is safer than alcohol. And citizens of Denver, 5 years ago, voted to decriminalize marijuana on a campaign based on marijuana being safer than alcohol. So I guess I have about 600,000 voters that actually agreed with me on that one when put to the test. So after a very short amount of time of looking at the drug issue, I advocated and continue to advocate to this day the legalization of marijuana. And when I talk about legalizing pot, it's never going to be legal for kids to smoke pot. It's never going to be legal to smoke pot, become impaired, get behind the wheel of a car. Much like alcohol. We now have, I think, 30 million felons in this country that, but for our drug laws, would otherwise be tax-paying, law-abiding citizens. I don't know why we can't make the same correlation from alcohol as we do with drugs today. So I advocate the legalization of marijuana. With regard to all other drugs, I advocate harm reduction strategies, which in a nutshell is looking at the drug problem first as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. I have come to the conclusion that 90% of the drug problem is prohibition-related, not use-related, and that is not to discount the problems with use and abuse, but that ought to be the focus. So fast forward, I get out of office January 1, 2003. I'd gotten to serve 2 terms as governor of New Mexico. I was term limited. I am a firm believer in term limits. I think we're well served by politicians that can only be in office for a limited amount of time. I think politicians do good things as a result of being term limited because there isn't this, it's kind of a fun job. I mean, it was a 24/7 job. And it would have been kind of nice to, to have stayed in that gig, if you will. But to do that, maybe you wouldn't follow your principles like you might. Maybe you wouldn't stick your neck out like you should. Do the right thing as opposed to whatever you thought it was going to take to get reelected. So anyway, I get out of office. I don't want to have a say in what's happening in the state. I don't want to have a say in what's happening nationally. I had my shot. I really thought I made the most out of it. But about 16 months ago, I find myself just outraged over what's happening in this country today. And that outrage really stems from the fact that we're bankrupt, that 43 cents out of every dollar that we're spending is borrowed, that spending is absolutely out of control. Spending is going up across the board, and so are taxes. Taxes are going up across the board. I will tell you, as governor of New Mexico, not one single tax was increased over 8 years. Not a penny of tax over 8 years. Of course, I was able to veto tax increases. I will tell you that as governor of New Mexico, I must have had a dozen bills that had to do with increasing entitlement benefits for state employees. I vetoed all that legislation. I did not add one penny to entitlement obligation in New Mexico because, to me, it was a Ponzi scheme. There's just no way that this was sustainable going into the future. Didn't go anywhere, but I proposed legislation in New Mexico. Actually, Kip Nicely, who is here, who's a state senator in New Mexico, proposed legislation along with me to change the state retirement system from a defined benefit to a defined contribution system. It didn't go anywhere, but it was the right thing to do. So I find myself outraged. I want to try and put a voice to this nationally, this outrage over being bankrupt. And of course, bankrupt. The federal government can print money to cover its obligations, so bankruptcy manifests itself in the fact that we've got a whole bunch more dollars in the system chasing the same goods and services. To me, this is going to result in higher prices. To me, this is going to result in inflation. And the states can't print their own money. The states, a big shoe to drop is the fact that 50 states are underwater when it comes to their entitlement obligations. Promises made that should have never been made. Ponzi schemes that we've seen growing up that we just knew weren't sustainable, and yet we kind of all stood back too. Gee, I just don't know how this is going to work, but I guess it'll work, or someday it'll melt down and we'll have to deal with it. Well, it's melted down and we've got to deal with it, and we've got to deal with it right now. So looking at slashing spending, looking at cutting spending by 43%, 43% just to get our revenues in line with expenditures. So that means Medicare. I think there needs to be some means testing when it comes to Medicare. When Medicare was adopted in the mid-60s, it was estimated to cost $10 billion in 1980. It cost $100 billion. And today it's $500 billion, and it hasn't even begun to see the pressures that it's going to see with the baby boomers just becoming eligible for benefit. Social Security. It's got to be reformed to have it viable into the future. And that reform, I would like to see the privatization of Social Security. Make it a defined contribution as opposed to defined benefit. Raise the retirement age. But these steps have to be taken. They have to be taken now. Medicaid. I think Medicaid probably has to be capitated when it comes to the states. We have a finite amount of money that we want to spend. Give it to the states and let the states deal with that. Believing in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, believing in states' rights, believing in 50 laboratories of innovation that we seem to be moving further and further away from. Abolishing the Federal Department of Education. On that, the Federal Department of Education gives each state about 11 cents out of the dollars that they spend for education. But it comes with about 16 cents worth of strings attached. So it's really a negative to take federal money. If you just returned forget about vouchers, forget about everything. Just give education back to the states and see 50 states engaged in this innovation race when it comes to education. You would see some true best practices emerge that other states would emulate, and I would just suggest that in and of itself would improve education nationally dramatically.